Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Michael, event host at RJ Julia. We appreciate your support of our store, our community, and support for these two wonderful authors. We're honored to host author Jessica Shattuck in conversation with Meg Waite Clayton. Did I do both of the names okay? Yeah. In conversation to discuss Jessica's new book, Last House. After a brief intro, we'll hear about the inspiration and process for creating this fantastic novel, and hopefully learn more about Jessica and Meg as well. We'll have a period for questions from our audience, and immediately after the event, both of our authors will be personalizing and signing copies of their books, which we have available for purchase at the register here just at the top of the stairs. Last House is a sweeping story of one family's complicated relationship to the resource that built their fortune and fueled their greatest tragedy. For Nick Taylor, World War II veteran turned company lawyer, oil is the key to the future. Thanks to his work for American Oil, he can provide every comfort for his family, including Last House, a secluded country escape deep in the mountains of Vermont. I hope that Jessica will share a little bit about her personal inspiration or connection to how this house came about in particular. Later in 1968, Nick's daughter, Catherine, was swept up in protests and struggles that marked the tumultuous period. Resistance to the Vietnam War and the fight for equal rights, with specific attention to rising protests against the country's dependence on big oil. Last House tells the story of one American family during an age of grand ideals and even greater downfalls. Jessica Shattuck is the New York Times bestselling author of The Woman in the Castle, The Hazards of Good Breeding, and Perfect Life. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, Glamour, Mother Jones, and Wired, among other publications. Meg Waite Clayton is the New York Times and internationally best-selling author of 8 novels, most recently The Postmistress of Paris and The Last Train to London. Her novels have been published in 24 languages. She's written more than 100 pieces for newspapers, magazines, and public radio. She's a mentor in the Op-Ed Project and member of the National Book Critics Circle and the California Bar. Maybe not as brief for the introduction as I hoped, but there was a lot. Please help me welcome Meg and Jessica.
I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so happy to be the one that gets to lead this conversation. I love this book. It's absolutely wonderful. And we're going to talk for maybe half hour or so, and then have questions. So, you know, as you have questions as you go along, just come up with them. And I think we're going to start with Jessica just reading a little bit. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you all for coming. It's so fun to be here, and thank you to RJ Julia for having me. This is such a great bookstore, as you all know, and that's why you're here. But you should know also it's very famous among writers. It's like, oh, are you going to go? Oh, of course, you've got to go read RJ Julia. That's a story. Because you do so much amazing stuff for your community and for the larger community of writers and readers. So I appreciate
Fortunate
that.
to have authors like yourself. That's important.
Yeah, you guys are spoiled because you think that, you know,
Yeah,
every
right.
yeah. Great authors, and
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you, it's not the
It
case. So
definitely
it's
not the
really
case, right,
special.
right. So, okay, I will start here. I'm gonna also say, it's funny, just before I read, this is a little, but we've been talking about this, but this is only my 3rd day on, the book came out on Tuesday. So this is all still pretty new to me for this book. And there's something that I think when you're not a writer, you don't necessarily know, which is that we live these kind of like binary lives where you spend all this time writing and being alone with your thoughts and your characters and kind of talking to your dogs and maybe nobody else all day. And in my case, I am a very slow writer. So this book took like 7 years to write. And then suddenly you bring the book into the world and your job is completely the opposite. And you're actually out in the world talking to people all the time and communicating, and it's totally, it's very different than what we do when we're sitting at our desks. So bear with me. 7 years of desk work. Okay, so this is the beginning of chapter 1. There's a prologue before it that I'm not going to read. Mapleton, 1953. In Mapleton, it was spring. Purple crocuses pushed up from the earth, and the smell of new grass and defrosting decay floated in the kitchen window, opened for the first time since the Taylors had moved into the house. Bet Taylor attempted to feed Harry, the baby, breakfast while helping Catherine, age 6, lace her shoes to go outside. Nick had been gone for over a month, the longest they'd been apart since the war. In his absence, the house had taken on a cozy, if jumbled and slightly claustrophobic feel. Bet made eggs and toast for supper and left the dishes in the sink overnight. She let Catherine color in the living room and Harry sleep beside her in bed. And for the past week, they had all been sick with a cold. This was the first morning Bet felt herself again. She was desperate to escape the confines of her household and go out into the world. As soon as Eileen, the housekeeper who came twice a week, arrived, Bet kissed the children goodbye, pulled on her coat, and climbed into the car. The town was gathering for a peculiar event: the destruction of its oldest house, a dilapidated colonial on Main Street, the first step toward the construction of a drive-in movie theater. Bet had derided the idea of such a spectacle when it was first advertised. "Don't gape at the misfortune of others," she could hear her mother saying. But this morning, her thirst for human contact was stronger than her scruples. Anyway, the old Bainbridge house wrecking wasn't really a misfortune. The whole town was delighted by the project, and Mrs. Bainbridge herself had been moved into a nursing home. Still, the house had been built by a genuine Revolutionary War hero. Once upon a time, a family had lived there. On the steps of the soon-to-be demolished house, Martin and Christina Peel, the champions of the project and social king and queen of Mapleton, stood looking impatient. He with a megaphone in hand, she with a bright artificial smile that conveyed underlying anxiety. "Greetings, hello," Martin Peel tested the megaphone. The crowd grew silent. "I'm thrilled to welcome you here today to begin an exciting new chapter in our town's life," Martin continued. "With the clearing of this lot, we officially begin construction of a venture that will bring to Mapleton one of the great pleasures of modern life, the movies." The crowd clapped and cheered. "Onward to the future," Martin crowed. On cue, or maybe a little early, the engine of the excavator roared to life. There was a collective intake of breath, and the Peels scrambled from the steps. Bet watched spellbound as the giant machine rumbled forward, and its shovel, curled like a fist, swung up and smashed into the house. The front windows shattered. The fist-like action was repeated once, twice, and then a third time, when it ripped through the front wall, splintering the clapboards and exposing dark, ancient seaweed insulation beneath. The house revealed itself to be entirely breakable, no sturdier than a bird's nest. It made an ugly cracking noise. Bet had once been inside this house. It was on the market when she and Nick were looking at properties in Mapleton. The real estate agent had led them through hastily. Plans for the town's acquisition were possibly already afoot. The rooms were small and dark, with original leaded windows that let in only a dim and filtered light. Pigs and chickens had lived in what was now a washroom, the agent informed them. Illegal ammunition had been stored under the stairs by the local militia. It had given Bet a depressing, poignant feeling, even before the shock of Mrs. Bainbridge herself in her wheelchair in the corner, apparently not yet moved into the old people's home. She had seemed barely sentient, but when she saw Catherine, her face lit up. Catherine surprised them all by going to her and extending her hand. "I like your house," she said in a clear, unafraid voice, and Mrs. Bainbridge smiled. What did the old woman see? Herself as a child? Someone she'd once known? Bet looked around at the spectators now. Some of them had brought children who clutched the fence with chubby fingers, watching with rapt attention. Their presence seemed ugly to her suddenly. People had brought their children to witness an act of violence and destruction. In another era, would they have gathered to watch a witch get stoned? But she was here too, of course. Her judgment was hypocritical. She thought of what Nick said when they had first moved from Manhattan. There are nice people everywhere.
So it's interesting, when I was thinking about, and since you said you wanted to read, I didn't know if you already had an idea what you wanted to read. I didn't suggest, but that was the passage I was going to suggest. And the reason is because you introduced the characters are all there. That and Nick and the kids, Catherine and Harry, and this idea of an old house, even though it's not the last house. And so it's a really nice, rich introduction to the book. So I wanted to ask, kind of start out and ask, is there a last house somewhere? Is that, where did that?
My aunt is sitting right there. There is a fiction, I mean, Last House is an entirely fictional creation, but there are germs, as you know, like we're always taking germs of ideas from real things. And I grew up going to my grandparents' house in Vermont, which was similar to, it was not actually as remote as Last House in this book is, but as a child, I felt it was that remote because it was the kind of place that you have to get onto one dirt road and then another dirt road and then another dirt road. And once we were there, it was like, if you have to go to the town to get food, like that's a big deal. And now I actually can see it's like, it's only like 15 minutes to the town, but somehow it was sort of, it's still psychologically like, oh, this is really far away. So that feeling of remoteness and escape was definitely something I was picturing when I was writing about the Last House in this book. And the other germ of the idea for Last House came from a sort of funny coincidence, which was that I think I was headed up one weekend in the winter, you know, maybe 10 years ago or so, because the house is still in our family. And a friend of mine who knows the area said, oh, that's where you're going up there. That's where I heard that's where all the old CIA guys go to retire. And I was like, what? I've never heard of this. And she said, oh yeah, that's the rumor. And that was sort of a seed that got the wheels of my imagination spinning. And suddenly it was kind of like, well, it is such a small place and it's so remote. And what would a bunch of CIA guys be escaping from, and what would they be escaping to? And that was kind of the one start of this.
So is that's where so was the house the inspiration? It's like when you're sitting down, when you're sitting down and thinking, what am I gonna write next?
Yeah.
Started with the house?
Well, you know, it started with that idea, kind of thinking about CIA guys and like coming together in a community, sort of what do you do after you've retired? What do the wives do? How much do they know about each other and who are these people? So that was sort of the first early germ of it. But I would back up actually, and in a macro level, the idea that was in the back of my mind when I started writing that was not that level sort of seed specific, but was that I had spent the last you know, when The Women in the Castle came out, that book also took me a really long time to write. And I had spent all that time thinking about what it meant to be German after World War II, because that book follows the lives of 3 German women in an abandoned castle after the war. And I'd spent all this time kind of researching that and thinking about that and sort of exploring and inhabiting the questions of like, how did they reinvent themselves? How did Germans live with their feeling of complicity and guilt? How did they live with the truth as it was excavated? And also, how did they live in what was it like to live in a defeated nation? And certainly for many years there, cities were full of rubble and the infrastructure was destroyed. And by the end of that time, I started thinking, well, what was it like to be American after World War II? And it was really like the exact inverse, because to be German after World War II was all of those things that I was just saying. But then to be American was like America came out of World War II smelling like a rose. And it was sort of the best we've ever felt about ourselves. We were the land of the home and, you know, the free and the brave, and we were, our ideology of democracy, and it was really like shored up, and it started this feeling of, okay, we can go around the world and help other nations, and so it was really the exact opposite. And then I kind of thought, like, well, I want to try to write about that as it plays out in an individual family's lives, in the characters' lives, in the same way that I had been writing about how the inverse was true in my German characters' lives.
So this book kind of has two major time periods. The 1950s where it opens, and then the late 1960s where it's kind of the second half of the book takes up. I'm just going to point out that part of the reason it takes her so long to write all these books is because each one it takes a totally different area, and she can't, you know, take all her knowledge that she already knows about World War II and repurpose it. So
That would have been smart.
when you started, did you imagine that it would have the two time periods, or did that kind of grow out of what you were doing?
That kind of grew out of what I was doing. I knew it was going to have the 50s, and I knew it was going to have the 70s with the same couple from the 50s who I was going to follow them. I didn't really know I was going to go into the next generation. And I actually, in the beginning, when I started writing this book, it now has a section at the end that's only about, it's like part 3 is maybe 50 pages long. But when I began writing it, that was actually that time period, which is a sort of alternate present day. There's a family taking refuge at Last House during a big blackout. That was actually the bulk of the book in my mind. And I was thinking it was really going to be mostly about this family in Last House. And then it was just going to go back to the backstory and some of the unraveling. But then as I started writing the backstory, I realized that was really where my heart was and what I wanted to explore. So it kind of shifted around that way. But yeah, then going into the late 60s, early 70s was a whole nother foray that just kind of grew out of once I had gotten to a certain point in the book. It was like, I need to follow this generation too. So.
And the early part of the book and the 50s story is a really interesting exploration of spooks, spies, right? Not retired ones, still active ones, but also Iran and oil and that whole kind of starting to build the military industrial complex in a way. And the detail in it is just fascinating and wonderful. And is that I said, like, was your dad an oil guy or something, or your mom? Or how did you know all that stuff?
Yeah, so my grandfather was a lawyer for an oil company. So, but I didn't know all of this through him. That wasn't like a subject of conversation. But as I started thinking about, as I was kind of getting into, like, I want to talk about America after I want to explore America after World War II, and I want to think about what some of the defining factors were. As soon as I started thinking about oil, it was like, how could that not be the defining factor of this book, right? In the way I mean, not only because the character of Nick has this, similar to my grandfather, has a job in the oil industry, because oil is so central to everything about our lives today. And before I started really researching this, I kind of knew that in the abstract, but then you start to drill down on it, and it's like everything from dental floss to, Tupperware, to obviously the gas that fuels our cars and trucks and boats. And we wouldn't have the suburbs without that gas, and we wouldn't have global, we wouldn't have like a global economy and an interconnected world without that. So it sort of felt like I was shining like once I started looking at it, it was like a black light had turned on in my mind, and I was seeing lint. Oil was like the lint that was everywhere. And it felt to me like using that as something for these characters to bounce off, kind of what it meant to them, what it meant to Nick in the beginning in 1950 versus what it means to him in 1970. And in 1950, nobody knew that oil was. Now we think of it as, this is synonymous with destruction and it's toxic for our planet. But in 1951, that wasn't, it was just this amazing, it was the future, and it was powering all of these things that were amazing developments for quality of life, not only in America, but around the world. So I always like going back to look at the original take on things that end up in a really different place.
Right.
So that's part of the arc of the book, because obviously by the time it gets to the present and it's Nick and Beth's children and grandchildren, or grandchildren and great grandchildren, really, oil occupies a really different place in their minds than it did in his and Beth's mind.
It's really, there's a really nice line that never really occurred to me before that, we're all talking about the war materials and everything. It all comes back to, if you don't have oil, you don't have any of it. And it was really true, and that never really struck me before. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, that was, so there were so many fun, like strange little pieces of my research around that, like what happened, part of why I chose Iran as the place for the original, the character of Nick sort of gets drawn into a CIA plot, and part of why I chose to have it be the actual plot that was, that unfolded in Iran, was that it was very enmeshed with oil. What we were doing there was enmeshed with shoring up the oil and making sure that the Russians didn't get it. And it was really like a very simple, there was this idea that like, if the Russians get that giant gas station, the power balance is going to be forever off. And now, who knows what's going to happen. And there was it was in the Red Scare. And so that was really that to kind of, if you can, there are a lot of our sort of politics and current affairs that you can, once you put that, again, the black light goes on. It's like, oh,
exactly. And so you go to a lot of interesting places in the book, especially in the first half of the book, where Nick is always going to the Middle East. Did you? My books are set in Paris because I like to go to Paris.
Right, that's very wise. Well, I did, I actually. Right. I know, this is a note to self. So I wanted to go to Iran when I first started writing this, and I actually was researching these, there's a tour that I had picked out, and I was like, I'm gonna go to the women's history of Iran, and it looked really cool. But it was right when it sort of went from being like whatever the second level down advisory is to being the like top level advisory, like you Americans do there, we will not necessarily be able to help you if you get into trouble. And if that's especially not good because you're whatever. So that was a shame. But what I did do is I went, this is really going to sound completely wrong because it's not a stand-in in any way, but I went to Oman, which is across the Gulf from Iran. And I was able to go do like camping in the desert on camels, which is, so there's this, that scene made its way. There's a chapter that has that. And it was interesting there were things that I could take out of that trip that did apply, even though the cultures are very different, the countries are very different. But I do think I wouldn't have been able to write some of the scenes, certainly the ones that are in the desert, without having done. I wouldn't have known there was like camel poo every. If that was an interesting revelation. Right, and it was funny. I was reading. My brother was reading the book recently. He said, "How did you know about that?" And I said, "Oh, I went to this, camel camping in the desert thing." He said, "Yeah, it's so interesting." And he's into science. And he's like, "Well, because I guess camel poo wouldn't evaporate. The desert is so dry that," and I was like, "Oh, that's why it was everywhere." And I didn't really understand why there was so much. And that's a very small detail in the book, but it is the kind of detail that I would never have thought to put in.
I was like, "The rain was washed it away, I guess."
Oh, right.
Do you find this in research? So often you can't make it up better than what you discover. And so the research, you always giving these little gems like.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they make it seem real.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I would think you probably have this too in your work, that I've thought a lot about what would our research when we're writing about historical periods without having the internet, it would be a really different thing, because obviously firsthand experience is the best. You're there on the camel in the desert, but you can get pretty close to some pretty granular detail by searching, what would somebody have been wearing in, what was the spring coat that was popular in 1953? And, and suddenly you're on an eBay page that has these coats and you can see what,
Right.
which is really pretty
From
amazing.
your first book was 2003.
Yeah.
Very different then.
Yeah.
I mean, the internet existed, but it wasn't.
No, you
Yeah.
weren't, nobody was, but I also,
Right.
that wasn't a historical novel, so I
Yeah.
didn't, but it still was, I
There's
mean,
no
it
things
was.
you research, right?
But I think about that with the historical novels of the past, it was a really different process, because
Yeah.
now I feel like most of us, we read a lot of books, we do a lot of primary source research, but then we also are always filling in the blanks from
Yeah.
things that you can just find quickly.
Yeah.
Little, Yes.
My first novel, I had to read a book, I needed a biography of, a photographer, and it was out of print, and and I had to sit in the Vanderbilt library and read it in stacks, because I could get into the library, but I couldn't check out the book.
Right.
I didn't have the
Yeah.
collection, so it's just very different how it's changed. So your first couple novels were not historical, and then your last two have been.
Yeah.
Although it sounds like this one maybe didn't start out being historical.
right, it didn't, I went back into them, yeah.
Is that, is it different, and do you prefer it? Do you think you'll always write historical now? Do you think you'll go back and forth?
I mean, there's such a richness to when you're writing a historical book, and you feel like once you've done it, it's so much more work because you spend so much time researching and you have to get everything right. And but once you're doing that, it feels so meaningful. Like I feel that my work is in a certain way a personal meaning making journey, that I'm trying to understand the world better. And I guess as I've gotten older, I'm more interested in some of the bigger picture things about how does our work work, how does our world work? What does it mean to be American? What is it? Some of these big questions that I think you can kind of only get at if you're having some historical context. But that said, I also love writing current things. I remember the joy that I took in writing those first two books, and I do sort of feel like it would be a lot faster. So that I'm sticking with historical.
Were the first two?
Yes, they were faster. Yeah, they took 2 years.
We do write some contemporary stuff, because you just had a piece in the New York Times.
Yeah, so I had this weekend, I had a essay in the op-ed section about playing catch with my son. It was a Mother's Day essay, so I don't know if anybody read it.
Very
but
nice,
it's,
yeah.
Yeah, you read it. And that was fun that kind of wrote itself, because we spend a lot of time outside.
It's so, it's interesting, because a book can take so long, and then even after you've written it, it takes a year to get it published.
Yeah,
And these pieces you write for newspapers, you write them in the morning sometimes, and then online in the afternoon, and in the paper the next morning, and it's just a whole different, a little
more immediate gratification.
Exactly. Exactly. Do you remember your first byline?
Oh, gosh. Well, I remember the first piece of fiction that I had published was the year I graduated, was right after college. And it was a short story that was printed in this literary magazine called The Sun.
Oh,
And yeah, I was very excited about it. I remember I called my dad and I told him, he said, well, oh, that's great, but I mean, did you try the New Yorker? No, I didn't. And then I did have a story in the New Yorker later, but so I guess that really he knew how to raise the bar. I was like, okay, next time I'll try with the New Yorker. But my first byline was actually probably in terms of like nonfiction and essay and that kind of writing. We were just talking about Meg has lived in San Francisco and I lived there briefly. And I went out there after college thinking I'll get a job in publishing, which made no sense because there's really no publishing in San Francisco. So there were some computer magazines there. So I got a job at a computer magazine that no longer exists. So I think my first byline is probably one of the some little story that I wrote about like a CD-ROM with an educational game on it.
It's a moment of saying name in print, right?
Yeah. Definitely, that's true.
Well, should we open up for questions? Do you guys wanna? I can keep
Sure.
asking forever if you.
I have to ask where in Vermont.
Oh, I like to say that I can't name the town.
Northeast Kingdom?
It's, no, but in the book, it's set in the Northeast Kingdom because it seems that that's the remoteness that like up there by Greensboro and St. Johnsbury. And
We have a
Yeah.
house outside
Okay.
St. John's, but when you
Yeah.
described it, I was like, we have to ask.
yeah, and I also love the name, the Northeast Kingdom.
Yeah.
So it's so magical and romantic. So that's where Last House is set. The house that I grew up going to is in southern Vermont, outside of Manchester.
Yep.
Yeah, not as remote.
Hello, my daughter published her first book last year, book of poetry, and it's so exciting to see her name on the cover. Any of your books autobiographical?
No, I mean, I think that I definitely take inspiration from family, and in both the women and I mean, it's interesting that I happen to have grandparents who fought in both sides of World War II. So the women in the castle definitely came out of years of thinking, my own thinking about what it meant to be half German and what it was like to be my grandparents after the war. And then when I started thinking about America after World War II, again, my grandparents provided sort of a jumping off place because also my American grandfather was in the war and he never spoke about it. And, but I felt very aware of it as a kid. I remember we had this Marine Corps blanket in the back of our car that was like for picnics and stuff. But I knew it had been his blanket in the war, and that was really kind of loomed large in my mind. And I didn't know I didn't have a picture. I actually remember, I did have a picture, which was completely wrong. I had a picture of him in a desert. I somehow thought the war had taken place in a desert and he'd probably been sleeping in this blanket. But it was, that was sort of, it was like this little mystery was planted and it was part of my life. And so, yeah, I mean, though it's certainly not autobiographical, but inspiration coming from family places. Yeah.
One of the beautiful things about fiction is you can say it isn't you. I'm just saying poetry is really hard to get published and you should be really proud.
Yeah.
That's really,
That's so true.
that's so fun. I love poetry.
I have a question, kind of similar, not exactly the same. So are there any, I'm always interested to hear if there are any like minor characters or maybe like less noticeable moments or scenes in the book that maybe have special significance to you, either something that is close to home, or maybe
Yeah.
something that you felt really proud
Yeah.
that you wrote that section.
Yeah, that's a fun question. I mean, there are always little things that you work in that are like, that will find their way in, and sometimes I'll sort of forget even where they came from. But the one that just popped into my mind for this book is that in my grandparents' house in Vermont, there was this little statue that really scared me as a kid. It came from Indonesia, and it was kind of like this creepy creature which had like a lolling tongue, and like it's called a Garuda. And it was scary to me. It was at the bottom of the stairs, and I was always a little terrified. And that comes up in this book because there is a similar thing it's an Iranian thing called a simurg in this book, but it's sort of a motif that comes up because each of the generations that I follow sort of sees it in their own way, and it works in. So that was a little piece. And actually, when I first started talking about this book to my editor, I said, I think I know the title already. It's called Garuda. That is a terrible name. And then I was like, oh, right, it's not even actually not Indonesia, I'm moving around. It's
It's a great creepy elements to the book. And it would be a great time after you read the book, for the whole part of the house.
Yeah, to get you to pick it up.
So the last house is, what's the state?
So Last House is called that because in the book, the original owner's name is John Last. And there's a section in the book when Nick and Bet basically they kind of right, it doesn't start with Last House. They come and visit through friends and they sort of fall in love with it. And Bet is at that time really taken with fears about nuclear war. Because this is the 50s and the hydrogen bomb had just been brought out, and so she sort of sees this house as like, wow, this is where we're going when the world ends. And so in that section, the house at that moment is kind of an abandoned old house that was built by this guy, John Last, and there are a few little remnants of him in the house, and she's very taken. That's its own little pocket of mystery for her, and she has sort of the same relationship to it as I have to certain things like the Garuda, and the military blanket, and where she's like, oh, who is John Last? And she knows he was this widow who lived there with 7 children, and sort of becomes large in her mind. But then I like that his name was John Last, and so it's Last House, and everyone keeps worrying the world is ending and that they're gonna come to Last House when the world ends. So it's like,
It's a name that really echoes really nicely throughout the book and all of its elements and all of its depth. It's really nice. So did you come up with that title then, or is that?
yeah.
Have you always, like for the first time ever got control over the title, which I've never had before. So, do you, have you always picked your titles?
I have, yeah, I've always picked.
They
those
never
titles.
let me keep my titles.
With the women in the council, that was the only book that I wasn't sure what the title was.
That's a great title.
So, yeah, and that kind of was like a little bit more, I mean, I kind of came up with it, but it was also. There were some conversations with my agent and my editor where we were kind of playing with things, but somehow each of the other books have been like, I kind of knew, as soon as I scrapped the gray. Other than that, I thought this was gonna be Garuda. By the time it was a finished draft, it was clear it was not gonna be called Garuda.
Look at the title of the book in Last Fiction. I mean, not Last Fiction, American Fiction. Have you seen it?
Yeah,
The name of the book.
yeah.
There's your title chosen.
Right.
And do you get input on the cover?
No, I haven't gotten, I mean, I guess maybe my first 2 books I got like, and actually for the Women in the Castle also I got like a choice, this cover or this cover, but 2 limited choices, and I'm not sure it was really my choice anyway, because there were a lot of other people putting it. This is my first book cover that I love. I really love it. And I liked it, but I didn't love it. And this one I love. And they actually commissioned this artist, a Spanish artist, to paint the picture for them. I don't think he reads English. I mean, they translated some quotes for him. They loved his artwork, and I got to say, like, yeah, I do like that artwork. And I love what he came up with, and I feel like it really resonates with me. And I actually was able to just buy the painting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's very fun. That's very, yeah, it's fun. It's a little known fact that most authors have control the title and the cover are considered marketing decisions.
Right.
And usually the publisher, they'll consult with you,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
but
and the
it's their
sales
decision.
people. Well, it's funny, I did an event this morning actually with Anne Hood and another writer. And all of our books, we were realizing were sort of in the same color scheme. And so we were like, is there something that all the publishers get like a memo that was like, this spring, make your books sort of blue, yellow.
I was just gonna ask you that because so many covers now are very similar.
Yeah,
like-
I don't know if that's true.
And this is so different.
Oh,
So
good, well, I'm
it's-
glad.
it's-
It's different.
No,
Not
you know,
that
there's-
different than Anne Hood's book.
Yeah.
It's
Look at that.
similar.
Authors go through trends, there was for a
Yeah.
while this year, you always got, especially if you're a female author, you got the back of a woman on
Oh,
your
yeah,
cover,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
the guys the male authors never got backs of women's on their covers. It was quite gentle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
My daughter got to keep her title. I do have a question. When you're in your historical fiction and you're creating your place, your environment, I know you went and absorbed the Middle East, but when you're developing your characters, are you in those characters too? When you're do you go there to
Yeah.
that place and how do you put yourself into that like I know as
Yeah.
a reader,
Yeah,
you can take me into that and I
Yeah.
can picture it
Yeah.
and some of the descriptions, your descriptions are so spot on. But as you're writing it,
yeah. How do we do that?
yeah, get you into that
Well,
environment,
yeah.
in the house, what the room is like and what you're like
Right.
in the room.
Sometimes, I mean, it's funny, sometimes it's just fully there immediately. And I would actually say when I was younger, like my first book, I remember it was like, oh, here I'm walking around in this house already built. It's like, this is it. Now I am a little bit more intentional and I think there's a little more like where I'll be picturing it, but I'm also like thinking a little more on the, well, this object actually is going to have meaning to me because it resonates with something else in the book. So I'm a little bit more, I like having structures within the structure. It's a little more complicated, and maybe a little less organic in that way, but I don't know what I do to get myself there. What I will tell you is that I'm not a good sit right down and get to work person. I'm like a dog that needs to turn in my bed like several times before I get to work. And I finally have just accepted that about myself and realized that like, it's okay. I'm just gonna sit at my desk and fritter for 45 minutes at least. And that might be returning emails. It might be like realizing that my son needs a pair of sneakers and I better quickly go on Zappos and buy, I mean, like nonsense stuff. Like I might get up and pluck my eyebrows and, but then I'll sit down and do it. Like, but so it was actually helpful to me because I was giving myself such a hard time about it. Get to the work, and then it was like, well, actually, that's what dogs do. It's just, I just need to like ease myself into this place. And then once I've taken care of these little bits, then there's room for my imagination to go and really be in these characters. And the characters are like friends, by the time you're done with the book, it's really like, I feel like I know them so well. I miss them.
Is there a part of you in each of them? Any character?
Yeah.
Sort of a random question. I can't imagine scaffolding a story. Do you do everything on the laptop or do you have a journal that you write ideas down or wake up in the night and be like, oh, I want to add this?
Yeah, I do have I don't really keep a journal, but I have a notebook.
Mhm.
And my notebook is probably, if someone is ever to like be looking at it, it would make no sense because it has ideas but then it will also have like the grocery list.
Right.
And, then it will also have like return this phone call and this and that kind of list. So it's really all of a lot of things.
Mhm.
I also have a file on my phone where I have notes for different things. So I have like the book that I'm kind of thinking about now. It's like I have little, it's just like literally in the notes app and I'll just sort of type stuff into there. But yeah, I'm not a big outliner to start out with. What I end up doing usually is I write quite a bit and then I'll realize like now I really need to figure out the structure of this.
Okay.
And I do like having there be a structure. I like old fashioned structured novels. I like Victorian novels. So I feel like then I start trying to outline it, but I actually do that mostly on the computer. I'll have like, I know there are a lot of, do you write by longhand?
I do not.
No, okay.
Because I cannot read my own handwriting.
I'm always amazed. I used to think like nobody writes longhand, but there are writers. Lauren Roth very famously writes all of her first drafts longhand. But I'm definitely the way I think is like I'm writing the sentence. I need to be able to go back and delete it even in the middle of the sentence as you sound like.
I often, it depends on, where I am. Sometimes I'll go to a journal and start just writing if I can't, if I'm stuck or whatever. And so I think that's the process. It's not just, there's something organic in how you get the words on the page that is, it's like, the kind of brush you would take if you were an artist,
Yeah.
it just makes a difference.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question also? We just started talking about the process and I'm interested in this book. You do such a good job of creating and sharing details and creating like a number of different characters that are really vivid. We also tell like an incredibly like kind of complex story in a relatively short amount of time. So I'm interested in, do you just have a really good internal barometer of like how much detail and when to move do you have a trusty editor or lots of revisions or what was that one?
It's actually, I love that question because another thing that was sort of a weird thing when I started writing out this book, it was different than other books, was that I intentionally was like, I'm gonna write a really long book. This is gonna be a really big book. And I was sort of on this kick where I was thinking there are all these books that are, why do male authors write long? There are many more big books by male authors. And I was like that, Donna Tartt is sort of an exception, because she writes kind of long. But then I found myself like, that wasn't even though the breadth of the material was, there's a lot there, but I'm a pretty strict editor with myself. And I don't go down a lot of super digressive paths. I feel like if I have something like that and it doesn't end up feeling like it's forwarding the plot or exploring a theme in a deeper way, then I'll cut it. And I just somehow, it's kind of, and I don't know if that, but the fact that I started with this idea, I'm gonna write really long, because I want to try out writing like a man, was that now I'm aware, like, am I just, is there something about being a woman that you edit yourself more, like in art as in life? I don't know, but I definitely, I do that anyway, yeah.
That's an interesting challenge, though.
Yeah,
To write that long book.
yeah,
Interesting, because it reads like, I mean, it has all the richness of a long book, but in, what, 300 pages? And so I think you just choose. Well,
yeah, I feel like I end up, I don't like feeling like I'm wasting anyone's time.
right.
No.
Alison McDermott was an early mentor of mine, and she said basically, women write shorter books because we're more efficient. Because we have to be, because we're not allowed to write longer.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. I missed that.
Think
Yeah.
interesting, except for, George Eliot, Middlemarch, and even that was published under a male name, right?
Yeah,
There aren't
right.
that many women who have written long books.
I feel very, I mean, a book is something you create with your reader. And that's what I love about novels as an art form. It's unlike any other art form, right? You could watch a really amazing movie or a TV show, and you're watching the thing that the team of people created and put in front of you. You can see a painting and you can be wowed by it, but it's the painting that artist made. Whereas a novel, you are recreating it in your own head. So each reader is having their own experience of it. And that's something I love, but it also makes me really aware of my readers' time and attention. And I'm kind of like, I feel like I owe them the sort of the structuring and the.
We have time for one more, but the last thing I want to do right now. Thanks, Sarah. You want to ask one more
How do
question?
you handle writing unpleasant scenes?
Oh, how do I handle it? I mean, if you have to write, I feel like in The Women in the Castle, there were definitely some really dark scenes. And there is a scene that we get to that takes place in the war. Like the book starts after the war, but about halfway through you get a little bit of Nick's experience in the war, and it's pretty rough. And it is kind of, I guess I did feel that comment, like I knew I wanted to do that, and it explained so much about him. It felt like I couldn't write his character without ultimately peeling down to that. But I knew it was kind of hard, and I felt also aware of myself being someone who has lived a life that has not been taught in, I have not like scrambled my way up a beach under fire. And so I did a lot to kind of bolster myself to write that scene. I read a lot of firsthand accounts. And I find memoirs really helpful. So as far as grounding you in the detail of the emotional experience of a person. So I guess that's.
And when you're finished writing it, where are you mentally?
Probably kind of stirred up, but like, I have to put the computer down and go get my son a snack. So like he comes home from school and he's ready for his snack. So it kind of, in a way, but it's kind of grounding. It's sort of, I actually imagine that if I wasn't in that balancing time right now, it might be harder. I might really get like, there's something nice about being like, okay, but actually this is my real life and I gotta walk the dog and I got, like, that's where I am. So.
I'm gonna ask one last question, which is, do you know you're done before your editor tells you you are?
Oh, yeah. I feel like I do, yeah. Yeah,
So you know when you're done.
Yeah. yeah, although there is a certain amount of like, I guess once it's done and there's a full draft, then there is that little bit of like, you can endlessly go back and it's coming back to me from the copy editor, and then it's the second round of copy edits, and I have to kind of stop myself from being like, but wait, no, actually. this- this is where it is." No, like now it's.
Can I just ask real quick, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? Or were you an English major? What's your background?
I was an English major, and I feel like I did always know I wanted to be a writer. When I was a kid, I used to write poems.
Mhm.
And it was, I mean, I really thank my parents for really encouraging that, and I got a lot of recognition and support, and they clearly loved my poetry when I was a kid. And that it started to become, so I feel like very early on, I was also a huge reader, and most writers, I think, were big readers as kids. And so it was just sort of a part of my identity. I didn't know if I would be able to become a writer, but I always knew that I loved writing.
Did you know writers when you were brand
Good question. Not fiction writers, no. Yeah, did you?
No.
Yeah.
I came from a family of accountants and.
Oh.
I was supposed to be an accountant.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I had an uncle, a great uncle who wrote, but he was an academic, he wrote nonfiction.
Mm.
But I knew he was a writer, so that was,
It was a thing.
I
Somebody
knew there was a
was-
person
that
who
was
was
the
a
thing.
writer, but he was also a professor, so it was kind of like, it was a, yeah.
Very good. If you have additional questions, comments, praise for Meg and Jessica, stick around. We'll have your books. You can get your books signed and personalized also. Everybody.
And
don't
can I
forget-
add, can
Oh,
I
yeah.
add quickly, just thank you so much, Meg, and I hope you guys will buy her amazing book. And it's so nice to have a partner in conversation when you're doing events. So and it's really like expects the other person to read your book and come up with questions. Really appreciate it. And Meg is a wonderful
Truly a
writer.
pleasure.
So.
I had read, before I met Jessica, I had not met her before we decided to do this, but, I had read Woman Capsule and just loved it. So when we were introduced through a mutual friend, I was like, oh, I loved her book. I'll talk to her. It's great. Really a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Meg, and thank you, Jessica.